The night my parents told me to leave, the Christmas lights were already on. They blinked softly along the roofline, red and white, steady and cheerful, like nothing in the world was wrong. Inside the house, the smell of cinnamon and pine cleaner still hung in the air. My mother had been decorating earlier. My father had just finished hanging the wreath. It was the kind of night families take photos. Instead, mine told me to pack. "Emily," my father said, folding his arms the way he always did when he'd already made up his mind. "You're old enough now. It's time you stand on your own." My mother didn't look at me. She stood by the counter, wiping a spot that was already clean. "We can't keep carrying you," she added. "Not when your brother and sister still need us." That was how it always started. Jason and Melissa. Their names came first. Mine came with conditions. I glanced down the hallway. Jason's door was closed, music playing softly behind it. Melissa's laughter drifted from the living room where she was scrolling on her phone, completely unaware that one child was being removed to make room for the others. I was 24. I had a job. I paid their rent. I covered groceries more often than anyone admitted. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't reckless. But I was expendable. "You can take your coat," my mother said finally. "We'll box the rest later." Later never came. When I stepped outside, my father locked the door behind me. Not angrily, not dramatically, just firmly. As if he were closing a chapter he'd already decided was finished. I stood there for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of the house continuing without me. The clink of ornaments, the hum of the heater. Normal life. Then I walked to my car. I slept sitting upright that night, my coat pulled tight, my breath fogging the windshield every time I exhaled. I kept telling myself this was temporary, that in the morning things would make sense, that someone would realize this had gone too far. They didn't. What I kept thinking about instead was my grandfather, Thomas Miller. He died when I was 16, but for most of my childhood, he was the one constant in my life. When my parents were busy with Jason's sports or Melissa's recitals, I was at my grandfather's small house on the edge of town. When things felt too loud at home, he gave me silence without judgment. People used to say I reminded him of my grandmother Eleanor, who had passed years before I was born. Same quiet way of listening, same habit of thinking before speaking. My mother hated that comparison. My father dismissed it as sentiment. My grandfather never did. Before he died, he gave me a plain manila envelope. No ceremony, no explanation beyond a single sentence I didn't understand at the time. "If there ever comes a day when you realize no one is standing with you," he said, "take this to the bank." I'd tucked it into a box and forgotten about it. Until now. The next morning I drove to First Union Bank, my hands shaking on the steering wheel more from exhaustion than fear. The envelope felt heavier than paper as I slid it across the counter. The teller frowned slightly when she saw the name. "Thomas Miller," she repeated, typing. Her smile faded. She excused herself and disappeared into the back. Minutes passed. Then more. When she returned, she wasn't alone. The man with her introduced himself as Michael Harris, the branch manager. He didn't offer his hand. He gestured toward a chair instead. "Ms. Carter," he said carefully, "there are some complications with this account." I felt my stomach tighten. "What kind of complications?" I asked. He hesitated. "Before I can say more, I need to verify your identity and your relationship to Mr. Miller." I handed over my ID. He studied it longer than necessary. Then he said something that made my pulse spike. "This trust has been under guardianship." Guardianship. The word echoed in my head. "I don't understand," I said. "I've never had a guardian." He met my eyes. "On paper you have." He explained slowly, choosing his words with care. After my grandfather passed away, a request had been submitted to the bank, a petition for temporary financial guardianship. It had come from my parents, Richard and Linda Carter. According to the records, they claimed I wasn't ready to manage significant assets on my own. I laughed a short, disbelieving sound. "That's ridiculous." Michael didn't smile. "The documentation was extensive," he said. That was when he slid a thin folder across the desk. Inside were copies of records I hadn't seen in years. Doctor's notes, therapy summaries, letters from a school counselor, evidence. Not of who I was, but of who they had presented me to be. As a teenager, I'd struggled, not in the way my parents described, but enough to be noticeable. I was quieter than most. I felt things deeply. When I pushed back against constant comparisons to Jason and Melissa, I was told I was being difficult. "You're too sensitive," my mother would say. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" my father asked. The pressure built slowly, invisibly. By 15, I was exhausted. By 16, I was overwhelmed. When I finally broke down, they took me to a therapist. I thought it was because they cared. Now I understood. They controlled the appointments, the conversations, the narrative. They emphasized every tear, every moment of doubt, every time I questioned myself. When I improved, they downplayed it. When I struggled, they documented it. By the time my grandfather died, they already had what they needed. Proof. Michael closed the folder. "Ms. Carter," he said gently, "based on what I'm seeing, your parents have renewed this guardianship multiple times." How, I asked. "I was an adult." "They cited ongoing emotional instability," he replied, "and requested extensions." My throat felt tight, and no one questioned it. "The reports appeared legitimate," he said, "and guardianship requests from parents are rarely challenged unless contested by the person being controlled, which I had never been allowed to do." When I left the bank, the Christmas lights downtown were still glowing. Families were laughing. Cars were loaded with gifts. I sat in my car and stared straight ahead, my mind replaying the last 24 hours with brutal clarity. They hadn't kicked me out because they didn't need me. They'd kicked me out because I was getting too close to the truth. And somewhere between my grandfather's death and that locked front door, my parents had decided that controlling me was easier than loving me. Growing up, I learned early that love in my family had conditions. They were never written down, never spoken out loud in one clear sentence, but they were enforced every day in small, quiet ways that were easy to deny and impossible to forget. My brother Jason was the first child. Confident, loud, athletic, the kind of kid teachers praised without trying. My parents talked about him like he was an investment. His future was discussed openly at the dinner table, college funds, sports camps, opportunities he deserved. My sister Melissa came next. Pretty emotional, expressive. She needed attention and she got it. When she cried, my mother rushed to her side. When she failed, my father reassured her it wasn't her fault. And then there was me. I was the quiet one, the observant one, the child who noticed when voices changed tone, when tension entered a room before words did. I learned not to interrupt, not to demand, not to take up space. "Emily is easy," my mother used to say. "She doesn't need much," my father agreed. At first I thought it was a compliment. Later I understood it was a dismissal. When Jason needed new equipment for sports, money appeared. When Melissa wanted private lessons, schedules rearranged themselves. When I asked for something, anything, I was told to wait. "You're stronger," my mother said. "You can handle it," my father added. That phrase followed me everywhere. I handled it when I was overlooked. I handled it when my achievements were minimized. I handled it when my needs were inconvenient. What my parents never noticed was that handling it didn't mean it didn't hurt. My refuge was my grandfather, Thomas Miller. He lived alone in a modest house just outside town, surrounded by old books and quiet afternoons. My parents said it was good for me to spend time there. Less work for them, more space for the kids who needed attention. I spent entire weekends with him. He never rushed me, never compared me, never told me I was too sensitive. He listened. He'd pour tea and sit across from me at the small kitchen table waiting until I spoke. And when I did, he took my words seriously, even when they were clumsy or uncertain. "You remind me of Eleanor," he told me once, smiling softly. Eleanor was my grandmother, the woman everyone said I resembled, but no one liked to talk about. She'd been thoughtful, reserved, emotional in a way my family found uncomfortable. My mother hated the comparison. "You don't need to fill her head with that," she snapped once when she overheard him. "Emily needs to toughen up." My grandfather said nothing. He never argued with my parents in front of me. He didn't have to. When I was 12, I started staying with him more often. My parents framed it as convenience. Jason had games, Melissa had recitals. Their schedules were full. Mine, apparently, was flexible. I learned later that my grandfather had insisted. He'd noticed the way I flinched when voices rose, the way I shrank when compared, the way I apologized for things that weren't my fault. Let her stay with me, he'd told my parents. She needs quiet. They didn't resist. It was easier than changing. Those years shaped me. I learned patience from him, discipline, how to sit with discomfort without turning it into shame. He taught me how to read people by watching what they didn't say, how to protect parts of yourself without building walls. He never called me weak. He called me aware. The tension with my parents grew as I got older. They didn't like how close I was to him, didn't like that I trusted him more, didn't like that he treated me as an individual instead of a problem to manage. "He spoils her," my mother complained. "He fills her head with nonsense," my father added. What they really meant was that he saw me, and they didn't like being reminded of what they ignored. When I hit my teenage years, the pressure intensified. Comparisons became sharper. Expectations shifted without warning. I was criticized for being too quiet one day, too emotional the next. "You overthink everything," my mother said. "You're making problems where there aren't any," my father insisted. But there were problems. They just didn't belong to me. By 15, I felt constantly on edge, like I was walking through my own house with glass under my feet. Any misstep could be used as proof that something was wrong with me. When I finally broke down, it wasn't sudden. It was cumulative. Years of being unseen compressed into a single moment where I couldn't breathe and didn't know why. My parents took me to a therapist. They said it was to help me. At the time, I believed them. My grandfather died the following year. Cancer, fast and unforgiving. I sat beside his bed in the final weeks, holding his hand, listening to his breathing slow. My parents visited twice. Jason and Melissa didn't come at all. On his last good day, he asked me to sit closer. "You're going to be all right," he told me, "even if they don't understand you." He pressed a manila envelope into my hands. "Keep this," he said. "Only use it if you need to." I didn't ask what it was. I trusted him. After he died, my parents grew distant in a way I couldn't explain at the time. They handled the arrangements, the paperwork, the conversations I wasn't invited into. I was grieving. They were calculating. I didn't know that while I was learning how to live without the one person who truly saw me, they were already deciding how to make sure his influence and his intentions never reached me fully. By the time I turned 18, the story of who I was had already been written for me. Not by me, by them. And they were prepared to defend it. There is a difference between struggling and being pushed. At the time, I didn't know which one I was experiencing. I only knew that the harder I tried to fit into my family, the more tightly the walls seemed to close around me. After my grandfather died, the house felt smaller. Not physically, emotionally. Jason took over more space without noticing. Melissa's moods dictated the tone of entire evenings. And my parents, who once barely noticed me, suddenly watched everything I did. What I said, how I reacted, how long I stayed quiet. Every emotion became evidence. If I cried, it meant I was unstable. If I stayed calm, it meant I was suppressing something dangerous. If I spoke up, I was overreacting. If I stayed silent, I was withdrawing. There was no safe way to exist. My therapy sessions continued. At first, they helped. I had someone who listened without interrupting, who didn't compare me to anyone else. I felt lighter after those early appointments. Then my parents started attending the sessions with me. They insisted it was for transparency. In reality, they controlled the room. They spoke first. They framed the narrative before I could open my mouth. Emily has always been sensitive, my mother said gently, hand resting on my knee like a display of concern. She internalizes things, my father added. We worry she won't cope well with adulthood. When I tried to explain how their constant comparisons affected me, my mother smiled apologetically at the therapist. See, she said, she takes everything personally. I learned quickly that every attempt to explain myself only reinforced the image they were building. So I stopped trying. At home, the pressure increased. They began setting standards that shifted without warning, rules that applied only to me. If Jason stayed out late, it was independence. If I did, it was irresponsibility. If Melissa quit something, it was self-care. If I hesitated, it was lack of commitment. My parents started monitoring my sleep, my grades, my social life. You seem tired, my mother would say. You're isolating yourself, my father observed. I wasn't isolating. I was avoiding conflict. But avoidance in their language was pathology. The first time my father used the phrase mental health history out loud, it was during an argument about college. I wanted to attend a school farther away. Not far, just far enough to breathe. That's not realistic for you, he said flatly. Why not? I asked. He sighed, tired and disappointed. With your emotional background, you need stability. The words landed hard. I hadn't realized my pain had been cataloged so neatly. What I didn't know then but understand clearly now was that my parents were building a file. Every doctor's note, every prescription refill, every temporary setback. They kept copies of everything. When I improved, they framed it as fragile progress. When I struggled, they documented it carefully. They encouraged me to take a gap semester after one particularly difficult year, calling it a healthy choice. It's just to reset, my mother said. No pressure. Later, that gap would be cited as proof that I couldn't handle responsibility. My grandfather's trust sat untouched during this time. I didn't even know its full scope yet. I only knew it existed somewhere waiting. My parents knew more. They never mentioned it directly, but their behavior changed subtly. My father became more attentive to paperwork. My mother began asking pointed questions about my plans. What would you do if you had money? She asked once casually. I don't know, I replied. Probably save it. She smiled thinly. That's not always the smartest thing. By the time I turned 21, I was working part-time and contributing to household expenses. I paid without complaint. I thought this would prove something. Instead, it strengthened their argument. See, my father told relatives, she needs structure, guidance. They didn't see my responsibility as maturity. They saw it as dependency they could control. The guardianship request came quietly. I didn't receive a copy. I wasn't present for the meeting. I didn't sign anything. On paper, it looked clean, concerned parents. A young adult with a documented history of emotional instability. A significant financial asset requiring protection. The language was careful, almost kind, temporary, for my benefit. No one asked me how I felt about it. No one asked me if I agreed. Because on paper, my agreement wasn't required. What hurt the most wasn't the control. It was the realization that my pain had never scared them. It had empowered them. Every moment I'd thought they were helping me through weakness, they were quietly ensuring I would never be seen as strong enough to stand on my own. Years later, sitting in my car outside the bank replaying these memories, I felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not sadness, anger, cold, focused, clarifying. For the first time, the story they'd told about me began to crack. And through that crack, I saw something else. Intent. Looking back, the most frightening part wasn't that my parents controlled my money. It was how carefully they made it look reasonable. From the outside, there was nothing dramatic. No shouting matches, no police reports, no obvious abuse that could be pointed to and named. What they did instead was quieter, slower, and far more effective. They applied pressure until I bent. And when I bent, they called it proof. By the time I turned 22, my emotional history had been neatly packaged into a narrative that served them perfectly. On paper, I was not incapable. I was questionable. That distinction mattered. My parents never claimed I was dangerous or delusional. They didn't need to. They framed me as fragile, uncertain. Someone who meant well but struggled under stress. It was subtle, strategic, and it worked. The guardianship request they filed wasn't for my entire life, just my finances. They argued that managing a large trust required emotional resilience and long-term planning capacity, two things they claimed I lacked due to documented depressive episodes during adolescence and early adulthood. They included medical summaries, not full records, just highlights. A therapist's note mentioning heightened anxiety during family conflict. A prescription history showing a short-term antidepressant. A school document noting a temporary leave of absence. Each item taken alone meant very little. Together they painted a picture. What made it worse was that much of it was true. I had been anxious. I had been depressed. I had struggled. But no one mentioned why. No one noted the constant comparisons, the shifting expectations, the way every expression of emotion was turned against me. Context didn't matter to the system. Documentation did. When my parents met with the bank's trust department, they didn't present themselves as villains. They presented themselves as worried caretakers. "We're not trying to control her," my mother said, according to the meeting notes I later obtained. "We're trying to protect her." My father emphasized responsibility. "This money was left with good intentions," he said. "But Emily has always had trouble handling pressure. We're afraid she'll make impulsive decisions and regret them." They asked for temporary guardianship, just until I was more stable. The bank followed protocol. They reviewed the documents. They verified signatures. They checked the legal boxes. From their perspective, this was a routine request. A young adult, concerned parents, a trust requiring oversight. There was no reason to suspect manipulation, no red flags that demanded investigation, so they approved it. What I didn't know then was that guardianship isn't a single decision. It's a renewable one. Every 2 years, my parents submitted updates. Brief reports stating that my condition remained unchanged, that continued oversight was recommended. They didn't have to prove I was incapable. Only that doubt remained. And doubt once planted is hard to remove. I was never notified. Legally, I didn't have to be. Because the guardianship had been granted when I was younger, and because it concerned finances rather than personal autonomy, the requirements were minimal. No hearing, no mandatory evaluation, no direct consent. Just paperwork. And my parents were very good at paperwork. As the years passed, I grew more independent. I worked, I paid bills, I managed deadlines, I functioned. But the record never updated, because updating it would have required my parents to admit I was capable, and if I was capable, they would lose control. When I sat across from Michael at the bank listening to him explain all this, I felt a slow, spreading numbness. So they can just keep this? I asked quietly. He hesitated. Not indefinitely, but until the guardianship is challenged. By who? By you. The irony nearly made me laugh. Challenging guardianship isn't simple. It requires evidence, legal representation, time. It requires proving not only that you are capable, but that the original claims no longer apply. And to do that, you have to relive everything they used against you. Every weak moment, every documented doubt, every label you worked so hard to outgrow. I left the bank with a list of requirements. A formal evaluation by an independent psychologist, proof of financial stability, legal counsel experienced in trust law. It felt overwhelming, which I realized bitterly was exactly what my parents had counted on. That night, I sat in my car again, scrolling through old messages from my mother. Are you feeling overwhelmed? You know stress isn't good for you. Let us handle this. They hadn't just taken control. They'd designed a system where resistance looked like instability. The next morning, I made my first call. Not to my parents, to a law office recommended by the bank. The woman who answered introduced herself as Sarah Collins. Her voice was calm, direct. "Tell me what's going on," she said. And for the first time in my life, I told the story without filtering it through fear. When I finished, there was a pause. Then Sarah spoke carefully. "What you're describing," she said, "is not concern. It's coercive control using legal instruments." My hands tightened around the phone. "So I'm not crazy?" I asked. "No," she replied firmly. "But this will take time." Time. Another word my parents had used like a weapon. But this time it felt different. Because for the first time, time was moving in my direction. Before we hung up, Sarah asked one last question. "Why do you think your grandfather left the trust to you?" I thought of Eleanor, of quiet afternoons, of being seen. Because he knew I said, and he knew they would do this. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Then let's make sure his intention survives them." When I ended the call, I sat there for a long time. I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry. And anger, when it's finally clear, is a powerful thing. The first thing Sarah told me was not to confront my parents. "Not yet," she said. "Right now, information matters more than emotion." So I stayed quiet. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't ask questions that might alert them. I focused on gathering proof slowly, carefully, the way my grandfather had taught me to do difficult things. Sarah requested the full guardianship file. Not the summaries, not the highlights, everything. What came back was thicker than I expected. The file read like a biography written by someone who didn't like me. There were timelines of my episodes, each one stripped of context. Notes about my difficulty regulating emotions. Observations about my tendency toward withdrawal under stress. What stunned me wasn't the content. It was the consistency. Every renewal report used the same phrases, the same concerns, the same conclusions copied almost word for word year after year. No updates, no improvements noted. No acknowledgement that I'd finished school, held jobs, paid bills, lived independently. According to this file, I had been frozen in time at 16. Sarah noticed it too. "This is unusual," she said, tapping a page with her pen. "Guardianship reviews are supposed to reflect change. So they just..." "Didn't I ask?" "They didn't have to," she replied. "Not unless someone questioned it. And no one had. Because no one else had access." The next step was an independent evaluation. Not one chosen by my parents. Not one influenced by old narratives. Someone new. Dr. Helen Rodriguez had been practicing for over 25 years. She specialized in adult competency evaluations. Her office was plain professional and refreshingly neutral. She didn't ask about my parents at first. She asked about me, my work, my finances, my routines, my stressors. She observed how I spoke, how I answered questions, how I corrected myself when I misspoke. She let silence stretch without rushing to fill it. At the end of the third session, she leaned back and looked at me steadily. "Emily," she said, "there is no clinical basis for ongoing financial guardianship." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. Dr. Rodriguez's report was thorough. It addressed my past struggles, honestly acknowledging periods of anxiety and depression, while making something else unmistakably clear. Those conditions were situational. They had improved with independence. They did not impair my judgment or decision-making capacity. In plain language, she wrote, "Ms. Carter demonstrates full competency to manage her financial affairs." Sarah smiled when she read it. "This," she said, "changes the balance." But one report wasn't enough. We needed to understand where the money had gone. The trust statements were revealing. Withdrawals labeled as educational support that coincided with Jason's tuition payments. Living expenses that matched Melissa's apartment rent. Transfers that paid off my parents' credit card debt. Very little of it had been used for me. And that mattered, because guardians are required to act in the best interest of the person they represent. Sarah circled a column of figures. "This," she said quietly, "is misuse. We submitted a formal request to the bank for a full audit." That's when the tone shifted. What had been routine suddenly became cautious. Questions were asked, clarifications requested, documents reviewed twice instead of once. The bank's legal department got involved. And somewhere in that process, my parents were notified. My mother called me that night. Her voice was tight controlled. "Emily," she said, "we received a notice from the bank." "Do you know anything about that?" I kept my voice neutral. "I've been asking questions." Her breath hitched slightly. "You should have come to us first," she said. "This feels aggressive." Aggressive. I thought of the years they'd quietly defined my identity without my consent. "I'm just trying to understand what's mine," I replied. There was a pause. Then my father's voice joined the call. "You're making a mistake," he said flatly. "You don't realize how this looks." "How what looks?" I asked. "Unstable," he said. Again. There it was. The word they always reached for when they felt threatened. Over the next week, more inconsistencies surfaced. Renewal forms submitted late but backdated. Medical notes referenced out of context. Signatures that didn't align with documented appointments. Nothing dramatic on its own. But together it suggested something worse than control. It suggested intent. Sarah explained it carefully. "If this goes to court," she said, "the question won't just be whether you're competent. It'll be whether they acted in bad faith." I swallowed. "What happens if that's proven?" "They lose the guardianship," she replied. "Immediately. And potentially face legal consequences." For the first time, I saw fear in my parents' messages. Not concern, not disappointment, fear. They asked to meet. They suggested mediation. They reminded me of family obligations. Jason texted too. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You're blowing things up for no reason." Melissa sent a longer message. "Mom is barely sleeping," she wrote. "Is this really worth it?" I didn't reply to either, because I finally understood something they didn't. This wasn't about revenge. It was about ending a lie that had been profitable for everyone but me. The bank scheduled a formal review hearing. Not a courtroom, not yet, but a panel, lawyers, trust officers, documentation laid bare. Sarah prepared me carefully. "They'll try to paint this as confusion," she said, "as overprotection, as misunderstanding." "What should I do?" I asked. "Tell the truth," she replied, "and let their records speak for themselves." The night before the hearing, I slept for the first time in weeks. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because I finally knew where I stood. Whatever happened next, the story they'd told about me was no longer the only one in the room, and that changed everything. The review hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning. No raised voices, no dramatic entrances, just a long table, polished wood, and people who made decisions for a living. On one side sat my parents with their attorney. On the other sat Sarah and me, a stack of documents between us. For the first time in my life, we were equals in the room. My parents didn't look at me when they walked in. My father focused on his phone. My mother clasped her hands too tightly in her lap, her smile fixed and brittle. Jason and Melissa weren't there. This wasn't a family matter anymore. It was a legal one. The bank's legal representative opened the session. "This is a review of financial guardianship," she said calmly. "Specifically whether it remains appropriate." My mother nodded quickly as if agreement itself could shape reality. Our side went second. Sarah spoke without emotion, laying out the timeline with clinical precision. She didn't accuse. She presented facts. Independent psychological evaluation, financial records, guardianship renewals lacking updated assessments. When she finished, she slid Dr. Rodriguez's report across the table. "This evaluation confirms full competency," Sarah said. "There is no legal basis for continued guardianship." My father shifted in his chair. Their attorney responded smoothly. He framed everything as caution, love, parental concern. "My clients acted out of fear," he said. "Fear of seeing their daughter overwhelmed by responsibility. Fear." It was the same word they'd used my entire life. Then came the first crack. A trust officer asked a question that seemed simple on the surface. Why were renewal reports identical over multiple review periods, silence stretched? My father cleared his throat. "Because her condition didn't change." The officer nodded slowly. "According to employment records, Ms. Carter maintained full-time work for 3 years. According to bank statements, she paid consistent expenses. According to tax filings, she filed independently." He paused. "What condition remained unchanged?" My father didn't answer. The second crack followed quickly. Another officer pointed to a series of withdrawals. These funds, she said, tapping the page, were categorized as expenditures for Ms. Carter's benefit. "Can you explain how tuition payments for Jason Carter fall under that category?" Jason's name hung in the air. My mother's spoke-up voice trembling slightly. It was all family support. "That's not the question," the officer replied evenly. My mother looked at my father. He said nothing. Then Sarah did something I hadn't expected. She asked me to speak. Not to defend myself, not to recount trauma, just to answer one question. "When did you first learn you were under guardianship?" I swallowed. "At the bank, last month." A murmur moved around the table. Guardianship without notification isn't illegal, but it's frowned upon. The officers exchanged glances. The room shifted. Questions became sharper. Why wasn't Emily informed when she turned 18? Why weren't evaluations updated? Why was trust money being redistributed? My parents' attorney tried to redirect, to soften, to generalize. But paper doesn't soften, it only reveals. The turning point came when the bank's internal auditor spoke. "There's another issue," he said. "We reviewed correspondence between the guardians and medical providers." My heart started to pound. We found repeated instances where concerns were emphasized beyond clinical notes. Language was interpreted. My mother's face drained of color. Interpreted was a polite word. Manipulated was closer. For the first time, my parents looked at me, not with authority, with fear. The decision didn't come that day, but the direction was clear. The panel suspended guardianship pending further review, effective immediately. I felt my shoulders drop as if I'd been carrying weight I didn't know how to name. Outside the building, my parents confronted me. My father's restraint snapped. "You embarrassed us," he hissed. "You had no right." "I had every right," I replied. My voice didn't shake. It was my life. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "We did this to protect you," she whispered. I met her gaze. "No," I said. "You did it to protect yourselves." She flinched. Over the following weeks, the fallout spread quietly. The bank froze discretionary withdrawals. The trust was reassigned to independent oversight. Formal notices were issued. Jason called first. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded. "I told the truth," I said. He hung up. Melissa sent messages filled with disbelief, then anger, then silence. My parents stopped calling altogether. Then came the letter. Certified. Official. The guardianship was terminated. Not paused. Not revised. Terminated. The bank's conclusion was unambiguous. The guardians had acted inappropriately and against the beneficiary's interests. Reading those words felt surreal. They were written about me, about my life. But the final twist hadn't come yet. Sarah called me the day after the termination. "There's something else," she said. "Something we didn't anticipate." My stomach tightened. "What your grandfather's trust," she said. "It wasn't just a trust. It was part of a larger structure, a foundation, named after my grandmother, Eleanor Miller." My parents hadn't known, because they'd never bothered to read past what benefited them. The foundation named a primary beneficiary. Not my parents, not Jason, not Melissa. Me. Sarah exhaled softly. "He didn't just leave you money," she said. "He left you authority." I closed my eyes. For the first time since his death, I understood the envelope. He hadn't been protecting me from poverty. He'd been protecting me from them. The foundation hearing happened 3 weeks later. This time it wasn't held at the bank. It was held in a small federal building downtown, the kind with beige walls and security guards who never look surprised. Everything about the place felt deliberate, built for decisions that don't get undone. My parents arrived separately. My father looked older than I remembered. His posture was rigid, jaw-clenched eyes sharp with anger that had nowhere to land. My mother sat 2 rows behind him, shoulders hunched, hands folded so tightly her knuckles were white. Jason and Melissa were there too. They didn't sit with my parents. They sat together. Sarah laid out the facts in order. Not dramatically, not emotionally, chronological, unavoidable. The Eleanor Miller Foundation, the trust structure, the guardianship filings, the misuse of funds, the medical exaggerations. Each document spoke for itself. When she finished, the judge looked up. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he said, "do you dispute any of this?" My father stood. His voice was controlled but brittle. "We acted as parents," he said. "We did what we believed was best." The judge nodded once. "That may be," he replied. but belief does not excuse misrepresentation. My father opened his mouth to argue. The judge raised a hand. You presented selective medical information, he continued. You renewed guardianship without updated evaluations. You used trust assets for individuals other than the beneficiary. He paused. That is not protection. That is exploitation. My mother began to cry. Not quietly, not performatively. It was the kind of crying that comes when the story you've told yourself collapses all at once. We were afraid, she said through tears. She was fragile. She reminded us of my mother-in-law. Eleanor was difficult. The judge looked at her steadily. Your discomfort does not negate her rights. Silence followed. The ruling was clear. The Eleanor Miller Foundation would remain intact. I would assume full control as primary beneficiary. My parents were permanently barred from any administrative role. In addition, the court ordered partial restitution for misused funds. Jason stared at the floor. Melissa whispered something under her breath that sounded like disbelief. Outside the courtroom, my father confronted me. His voice was low, shaking with fury. You destroyed this family. I looked at him. No, I said. You did. He laughed bitterly. You think this makes you strong? I didn't answer. Strength didn't need defending anymore. The consequences came quickly. The bank closed the joint accounts. The foundation's legal team took over oversight. My parents' financial flexibility vanished overnight. Jason called me 2 days later. His tone was different now, measured. Did you know about the foundation before all this? He asked. No, I replied. He exhaled sharply. They told us there was nothing left. That was the moment he understood. Not just what they'd done to me, what they'd done to him. Melissa didn't call. She sent a message instead. I don't know who you are anymore. I didn't reply. My parents tried one last approach. They sent a letter. No lawyer, no legal threats, just words. They wrote about intention, about mistakes, about love expressed poorly. They asked for forgiveness. They did not apologize. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Some things don't require a response. The foundation board met for the first time under my authority in early spring. I sat at the head of the table, not because I wanted power, because it was where I belonged. The foundation would fund mental health access for teenagers navigating family pressure, quiet support, no labels, no leverage. When the vote passed unanimously, I felt something loosen inside me. Not triumph, alignment. I ran into my mother weeks later at a grocery store. She looked smaller. When she saw me, she froze. Then she smiled weakly. I always knew you'd be fine, she said. I nodded once. That was never the question. I walked away before she could say anything else. That night, I took the envelope my grandfather had given me and placed it in a safe. I didn't need it anymore. He'd already done what he needed to do. I didn't celebrate when it was over. There was no dinner, no announcement, no moment where I sat back and thought I won. What I felt instead was quiet, the kind that settles in after a storm has passed and you're finally able to hear your own breathing again. For most of my life, noise had shaped my decisions. Expectations, comparisons, other people telling me who I was allowed to be. When all of that stopped, the silence felt unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. It felt honest. In the weeks that followed the ruling, my life became smaller in the best possible way. I moved into a modest apartment on the other side of town. Nothing fancy. Clean, quiet, mine. I bought second-hand furniture and didn't apologize for it. I stopped explaining my choices to people who had never listened anyway. The foundation work began slowly. Not big grants, not press releases, just careful planning, I insisted on one rule from the beginning: no child's pain would ever be turned into leverage. No records used as weapons. No help given with strings attached. The board understood. Some of them had lived through families like mine. Jason reached out again months later, not to argue, not to accuse, to ask questions. He wanted to know how the guardianship worked, how the money moved, how much had been taken. I answered calmly. When he finished listening, he said something that surprised me. They did the same thing to us, he admitted. Just differently. I didn't say I know. He needed to arrive there himself. Melissa never did. Her distance hardened into something permanent. I stopped checking my phone to see if she'd written. Letting go isn't dramatic when it finally happens. It's practical. You just stop waiting. My parents didn't try again. No surprise visits, no legal maneuvers, no sudden declarations of love. The silence between us stretched and settled into a boundary that didn't need enforcing. I learned something important during that time. Some people don't miss you. They miss the role you played. One afternoon, I visited my grandfather's old house. It had been sold years earlier, but the neighborhood hadn't changed much. The same trees, the same quiet streets. I sat on a bench across the road and let myself remember small things. The way he stirred his tea. The way he waited for me to finish my thoughts. The way he trusted me without needing proof. I understood then that what he'd given me wasn't just protection. It was permission. Permission to stop earning love. Permission to stop explaining myself. Permission to choose clarity over comfort. I never confronted my parents again. Not because I was afraid. Because there was nothing left to say that would change who they were. Closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from distance. The Foundation's first annual report came out quietly. No headlines, no interviews, just numbers, outcomes, lives touched. I read it alone at my kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling beside me, and felt something steady settle in my chest. This was mine. Not the money, the direction. People sometimes ask if I regret how far it went, if I wish I'd handled it more gently. I tell them the truth. I didn't choose the battlefield. I didn't write the rules. I just stopped playing by ones that were designed to erase me. That's not revenge. That's self-respect. If you're listening to this and you've spent years being the easy one, the strong one, the one who was told to endure because you always could, I want you to hear this clearly. Being capable does not mean being expendable. Being quiet does not mean being weak. And needing help does not give anyone the right to control your life. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop protecting the people who never protected you. If this story made you pause, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to reclaim something that should have been yours all along? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about boundaries, clarity, and quiet justice, subscribe and stay with us. You're not alone.